back in my childhood around the ages of 10 or 12. There's an incident that still lingers in my memory. Now, as an adult, it happened a long time ago, but the peculiar and eerie nature of the situation makes me recall it every now and then. Let me start by mentioning that this was in the early 2000s when cell phones weren't as ubiquitous, but my parents had them. However, we more commonly used our home phones, of which I believe we had 2 or 3. The primary one was in the kitchen, and there was another in the living room. We didn't have caller ID, so when a call came in, you wouldn't know who it was unless you answered. Being an only child, I found myself alone at home frequently when my parents went out for short trips. I was accustomed to it. So one night, about an hour after my parents left, I was in the kitchen and the phone rang. Assuming it was my parents, I picked it up, but to my surprise, it was a man's voice, sounding distinctly unfamiliar. It definitely wasn't my dad, and the man spoke very slowly, asking me who I was. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I figured he might be calling for one of my parents. Caught off guard, I couldn't think of anything to say and ended up hanging up. I went back to whatever I was doing, not remembering much about the rest of the time my parents were away that night. When they returned, there was no call back from the mysterious man. However, only a few days later, the calls resumed. This time, my parents had already gone to bed, and I was up late watching TV in the living room. It was a Friday night, so I had no school the next day. Around 11 p.m., an unusual hour for calls, the phone rang. Wondering who it could be, I let it ring, and after it stopped, I heard a beep indicating a voicemail. Listening to it in real time, the man's deep, slow voice returned, saying something like, "Hi, I thought you were home tonight." A chill ran down my spine before he hung up, intrigued and creeped out. I played the message back and found it incredibly odd. The following day, I forgot to inform my parents about the strange phone call, just as I had the previous day. However, later that night, we were all at home in the living room when the phone rang again, this time probably after 8 p.m. My mom answered, heard nothing on the other end, and the caller hung up. My dad dismissed it as a wrong number. But then I remembered the peculiar phone calls and recounted them to my parents, playing the message from the previous night. We all found it unsettling. The best guess was that it was someone with the wrong number or a prankster. That night, we didn't receive any more calls, and for about a week, everything seemed normal. In that time, I almost forgot about it. But then one night, I was home alone again. My parents were out, and it was dark outside. The phone rang, and thinking it might be my parents, I answered. To my surprise, it was the man's voice again. He started speaking, but I immediately hung up on him. Moments later, the phone rang again, and I was convinced it was him calling back when it stopped ringing. The answering machine indicated a new message, playing it back. I heard the man's voice saying he could see that I was home right now. This sent shivers down my spine. How did he know I was home? Peeking through the curtains, I saw a car parked on the street a little way behind our house. It was unusual for cars to be parked there. I couldn't identify who was inside, but the engine was running and the car didn't move. After watching for about 10 to 15 seconds, I couldn't take it anymore and ran to the phone. calling my mom on her cell. I explained the situation, and they headed home immediately. I was too afraid to look out the window again and hid behind the couch until my parents returned. About 10 minutes later, when they arrived, the car was gone. I wasn't sure where that guy went, but I was relieved he was no longer there after this incident. My parents didn't leave me home alone for a long time. Wherever they went, they insisted I accompany them. We also unplugged our home phone for about a month. When we finally plugged it back in, the guy didn't call again. I can't be certain if he was the one parked on the street, but I have a feeling it was. I also don't know who that guy was or why he kept calling us. A few years later, I got a new phone with a new number. When I called my best friend, I was pretty sure I knew her number and had it memorized. However, upon hearing a man's voice when she answered, I realized I had the wrong number. Apologizing, I hung up, but the guy called back immediately. I ignored the call and talked to my friend for about 10 minutes later that day. He tried calling me several times. Frustrated, I ignored all the calls. He persisted, calling me at least 5 more times that day. Finally, I answered. The man acted as if he hadn't been blowing up my phone and casually asked how I was doing. When I asked why he kept calling, he flat out ignored the question. Angry, I hung up on him and blocked his number, thinking it would put an end to the harassment. The very next day, I received a text from a new number. Asking why I had blocked him, I inquired about his identity, though I already knew who it was. It was the same guy who kept calling me. He probably created an account on one of those free text and call apps. I blocked this number too, but he didn't give up. A new number started calling me repeatedly later that day. I couldn't believe the extent this guy went to in order to contact me. He called about 10 times a day and just wouldn't leave me alone. This went on for more than an entire week. Frustrated and exhausted, I decided to get a new number. I had only had my previous number for about a week, and this guy wouldn't leave me alone. After changing numbers again, I was finally left alone. He probably continued calling and texting my old number, and I feel sorry for whoever got it next when he realized it wasn't me. Hopefully, he left them alone. I still can't believe the efforts he went through to get to me, but I'm glad it didn't escalate further. I live in a fairly small and quiet town, a bit out in the country. The story I'm about to tell you happened just a few months ago. One night I was sleeping but woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning. I heard my phone vibrating on the nightstand next to me. Ignoring it, someone called again. After probably the 3rd or 4th call, I woke up completely. Until that point, I had been half awake, just wanting to go back to sleep, not realizing how strange it was to receive a random phone call at this hour. Looking at the phone, it simply said unknown number on the screen. This was odd, and now fully awake, I could tell someone really wanted me to answer. I accepted the call and said hello, but at first heard nothing on the other end. Then I heard the sound of heavy and deliberate breathing. I asked multiple times who was calling, but all I got in response was the breathing noises. This had to be a joke. How else could I explain this? I was pretty sure that was the case. I mean, who calls someone at 2 o'clock in the morning and just breathes on the other end? They probably found some way to not make their number show and were pulling a prank on me. I said something like very funny, and then I hung up on them. Then I went back to sleep. They didn't call me for the rest of the night, and I woke up the next morning for work at my normal time, around 7 a.m. After getting up, I went into the kitchen, which is at the front of the house. That's when I noticed something on my front window. There was a post-it note sticking to the window, and I found this really odd. It hadn't been there the night before. It was an obvious view of me, and somebody had to have put it there recently. I walked outside and picked it off the window. There was writing in pen on the sticky note, which said, "Call me back." I got chills when I read it, connecting it to the call that I had gotten at 2 o'clock in the morning. This was really odd. I don't just live in a city where there are tons of houses, like I said. I'm a little more out in the countryside, and the houses are spread very far apart. I can barely even see my neighbor's house when I'm in my driveway. My driveway is also really long, and there are multiple no trespassing signs on it. For somebody to be on my property, which is pretty isolated, was really strange. I went to the police that day about it, just letting them know I didn't really feel like I was in danger, but I thought I would let them know about the situation because of how strange it was. It's a quiet town, and these things don't happen very often. Now it very well could have been some guy in the neighborhood pulling a prank. But I've never had any pranks pulled on me like that before. I couldn't really think of anybody who would do something like that to me either. Today it remains a mystery, and I haven't had any strange phone calls since. Back in the early 2000s, when cell phones were not as ubiquitous and landlines were the norm, I encountered a series of eerie events. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, my parents often left me home alone during their brief outings. One night the phone in the kitchen rang, and assuming it was my parents, I answered. To my surprise, a strange man's voice echoed through the receiver, inquiring about my identity. Feeling uneasy, I hung up, dismissing it as a possible wrong number. Days later, the mysterious caller resurfaced. This time, it was late at night, and the phone's persistent ringing left me on edge, ignoring the calls. I listened to the chilling voicemail. The same slow-paced voice mentioned my presence at home, sending shivers down my spine. A week passed without any disturbances until, once again, I found myself alone. Answering the phone revealed the same unsettling voice. He claimed to see me at home, prompting me to peer through the window. A parked car nearby intensified my fear. In a panic, I called my parents, who hurried home. Strangely, the mysterious car vanished. Despite this, my parents decided I shouldn't be left alone for a while, and we unplugged our home phones as a precaution. Weeks passed without incident, and we began to believe the ordeal was over. However, the haunting memories resurfaced years later. With a new phone number, an innocuous mistake led to an encounter with a persistent caller. Ignoring his repeated attempts, I finally answered, demanding an explanation. He evaded my questions, prompting frustration. Blocking his number only intensified his pursuit. With texts and calls flooding in from new numbers, this relentless harassment continued for over a week, pushing me to the point of changing my number once again. Finally left in peace, The ordeal raised unsettling questions about the lengths some individuals would go to instill fear in a small town where such incidents were rare. The lingering unease left me cautious, forever wondering about the identity of those who choose to disrupt the quietude of a seemingly ordinary life. In the quiet outskirts of a small town, where life unfolded at its unhurried pace, a peculiar series of events unfolded in the early 2000s that would forever cast a shadow on my sense of security. Back then, the prevalence of landlines far surpassed the novelty of cell phones. This context adds a layer of eeriness to an already unsettling tale. During one of those routine evenings when my parents ventured out, leaving me to my own devices, the phone in the kitchen pierced the tranquility. Expecting the familiar voices of my parents, I hesitantly picked up, to my disquiet. A stranger's voice, deliberate and slow, greeted me, inquiring about my identity. His unsettling presence made me fumble for words before abruptly hanging up. Days turned into nights, and a pattern emerged. Late one Friday night, the persistent ringing of the phone disrupted the usual quietude. I opted to ignore it, allowing the answering machine to capture the unsettling voicemail. The same enigmatic voice spoke of my presence, sending a chill down my spine. The walls of my seemingly secure home suddenly felt fragile, and the outside world ominous. A week of uneasy peace lapsed, but the calm was deceptive. Alone once more, I answered a call that reignited the dormant fear. The man claimed to observe me at that very moment, sparking a primal instinct to retreat from the window. My call to my parents brought a swift return, but the mysterious car had evaporated into the night, haunted by this unsettling encounter. Our precautionary measure was to unplug the home phones, a symbolic severance from the source of our unease. Weeks turned into months without any ominous calls, and the memory softened into the background of life. However, the echoes of this unsettling chapter reverberated years later when, armed with a new phone number, I encountered a relentless pursuer. A simple misdeal resulted in a barrage of calls and messages, escalating from an annoyance to a genuine threat. Blocking numbers proved futile. Each attempt only led to a new avenue of harassment. This persistent campaign forced me to change my number once again, and only then did the uninvited digital specter recede. The unease lingered, prompting questions about the nature of those who derive satisfaction from disrupting the ordinary lives of others. In the quaint tapestry of a small town, where familiarity bred comfort, the scars of these unsettling encounters served as a reminder that even in the most serene corners of the world, shadows could emerge, casting doubt on the once assured tranquility of an ordinary life.